Welcome to The Social Lens. I'm your host, Beatrice Goodwin, and today we're embarking on a fascinating journey through the labyrinth of human morality. Have you ever wondered why the same person can be completely honest when filing their taxes, but lie without hesitation when their spouse asks if they like their new haircut? Or why some cultures consider certain behaviors sacred while others see them as completely meaningless? Think of a time when you were driving home after a late night, music pumping, completely lost in the rhythm, and you suddenly realize that you've been speeding for the last 10 miles. No harm done, no one hurt, but technically, you broke the law. Are you immoral? Now imagine your aunt accidentally driving off in someone else's car because her key happened to start it. A 1 in a million fluke. She panics, returns it secretly, never leaving a note. Same level of wrongdoing? These aren't just philosophical puzzles. They're windows into the most complex operating system ever evolved, the human moral mind. Today, we're going to crack the code on why we make the ethical choices we do. And trust me, the answers will surprise you. If you love exploring the hidden logic behind everyday decisions and want more mind-bending podcasts on morality, psychology, and the science of choice, Scoob is your perfect companion. Scoob's AI-powered podcast app curates the most thought-provoking shows on human behavior and ethics, so you can keep questioning long after this episode ends. Download Scoob from the App Store or Play Store today. Get ready, because the journey into the heart of human morality starts now. Let's start with a mind-bending reality. Your moral compass is far more fragile than you think. The same ethical decision can swing dramatically based on factors so subtle, so seemingly irrelevant, that it's almost laughable if it weren't so profound. Consider this. Researchers have discovered that whether you're hungry or full can literally change your moral judgments. Your stress hormone levels, the cleanliness of your environment, even the language you're thinking in. All of these influence what you consider right or wrong. It's as if our moral GPS is constantly recalibrating based on data that seems completely unrelated to ethics. But here's where it gets really interesting. The biggest factor isn't your blood sugar or how tidy your office is. It's perspective. Whether a situation concerns you personally or happens to someone else can completely flip your moral evaluation. We're remarkably lenient judges of our own behavior and surprisingly, harsh critics of others doing the exact same thing. Think about identity activation. That moment when one aspect of who you are becomes dominant. You might judge a situation completely differently depending on whether you're thinking of yourself as a parent, a professional, a citizen, or just a human being. It's like having multiple moral operating systems running simultaneously, with different ones taking control depending on the context. This isn't a bug in human morality. It's a feature. But it raises a disturbing question. If our moral judgments are this malleable, this dependent on circumstances that seem irrelevant to ethics, what does that say about the nature of right and wrong itself? The plot thickens when we look across cultures. What's a sacred cow in one society, literally in some cases, is just dinner in another. These aren't minor disagreements about etiquette. These are fundamental schisms about what deserves moral consideration. Yet beneath this chaos, patterns emerge. There's something almost universal about the Golden Rule, though cultures frame it differently. Some say, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you," while others prefer the negative formulation, "Don't do to others what you wouldn't want done to you." It sounds like a simple, elegant solution, until you realize its fundamental flaw. It assumes everyone wants the same things. Imagine a masochist who enjoys pain meeting a sadist who enjoys causing it. The Golden Rule would suggest the masochist should hurt others, while the sadist should refuse to cause pain. It's a philosophical train wreck that highlights why even our most cherished moral principles can lead us astray. This is why philosophers and anthropologists have moved toward a more sophisticated principle, reciprocity. Not just treating others as you'd want to be treated, but considering and respecting their actual needs and desires in situations where you'd expect the same consideration. It's morality with a theory of mind. Ethics that acknowledges other people might actually be different from you. But even this expanded view reveals something unsettling. Our moral intuitions, those gut feelings about right and wrong, might be far more arbitrary than we'd like to admit. Now let's dive deeper into the architecture of human morality. Imagine morality not as a single, unified system, but as three distinct worlds that we constantly navigate, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes in direct conflict with each other. The first world is the ethic of autonomy, the moral universe that most educated Westerners inhabit without even realizing it. This is the realm of individual rights, personal freedom, and fairness. Here, the cardinal sin is harming others or restricting their liberty without justification. It's the morality of the Enlightenment, of liberal democracy, of my rights end where yours begin. In this world, the highest virtue is fairness, and the core principle is that every individual deserves equal consideration. It's elegant, logical, and feels intuitively correct to many of us. But it's just one moral world among three. The second is the ethic of community, a moral framework that prioritizes the group over the individual. Here, duty trumps personal desire, respect for hierarchy matters more than equality, and maintaining social harmony is paramount. This isn't the morality of rebellion, it's the morality of tradition, of knowing your place, of understanding that society functions because people fulfill their roles. In community-based morality, asking whether something is fair is less important than asking whether it maintains social cohesion. Loyalty becomes a virtue. Deference to authority isn't oppression but wisdom. And conventional norms aren't arbitrary rules but the glue that holds civilization together. The third world is perhaps the most alien to modern sensibilities, the ethic of divinity. This is morality, concerned with purity, sanctity, and the sacred. Here, certain things are not just wrong, but contaminating. They don't just cause harm, they pollute the moral order itself. This is the morality of the temple, where some acts are forbidden, not because they hurt anyone, but because they violate the sacred nature of existence. What's fascinating is that these aren't just academic categories. They're competing operating systems running in your brain right now. Depending on the situation, you might find yourself thinking in any of these moral languages. When you're outraged by unfair treatment, you're speaking autonomy. When you're disturbed by someone disrespecting their parents or their country, you're thinking community. When you're disgusted by behavior that seems to degrade human dignity, even if it doesn't technically harm anyone, you're operating in the realm of divinity. But here's where it gets psychologically interesting. Different cultures weight these three ethics very differently. That well-educated, higher-status American I mentioned, they're overwhelmingly focused on autonomy, fairness, individual rights, personal freedom. Ask them about loyalty to country or respect for authority, and they might give lip service to these ideas, but their moral gut doesn't really feel them. Meanwhile, people from more traditional cultures, or those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, tend to weight community and divinity much more heavily. They're not morally deficient. They're playing by a different rulebook entirely. This creates a fascinating paradox. We live in a world where people are literally speaking different moral languages, then wondering why they can't understand each other's ethical positions. It's like trying to have a conversation where one person is speaking mathematics, another is speaking poetry, and the third is speaking music. Richard Schrader, the anthropologist who first mapped this territory, wasn't trying to be a moral relativist. He wasn't saying all moral systems are equally valid, but he was revealing something profound. The moral sense in humans is far more complex, far more multifaceted than we typically acknowledge. Understanding these three ethics doesn't just explain cultural differences, it explains the civil wars happening within our own minds. That internal conflict you feel, when loyalty and fairness point in different directions? That's not moral confusion. That's your moral systems doing exactly what they evolved to do, just in a world more complex than the one they evolved for. Now let's tackle one of the most provocative questions in all of psychology. Why are we good at all? I'm not talking about philosophical goodness or religious virtue. I'm talking about the basic biological fact that humans routinely sacrifice their own interests to help others. From an evolutionary perspective, this should be impossible. Here's the puzzle. If evolution is about survival of the fittest, if natural selection ruthlessly eliminates any trait that reduces reproductive success, then kindness, generosity, and fairness should have been bred out of us millions of years ago. The fact that you'd return a lost wallet instead of keeping the cash should be as biologically impossible as growing wings. Yet here we are, moral creatures in a world that seems designed to reward the immoral. So what's going on? The traditional explanation involves two mechanisms: kin selection and reciprocal altruism. We help our relatives because they share our genes, and we help non-relatives because they might help us back later. It's elegant, it's logical, and it explains a lot of human behavior. But I want to propose a more intriguing possibility. What if morality isn't primarily about survival at all? What if it's about sex? Think about it this way. What do you absolutely not want to mention on a first date? Murder, check. Theft, definitely avoid. Cruelty to animals, best kept to yourself. Cheating, lying, selfishness, all conversation killers. The list of things you don't brag about to potential romantic partners reads like a catalog of immoral behavior. This isn't a coincidence. David Buss's massive cross-cultural study of mate preferences found something remarkable. Across 37 different cultures, kindness was the most desired trait in a romantic partner. Not intelligence, not physical attractiveness, not wealth or status. Kindness. We are literally sexually attracted to moral behavior. Think about Oscar Wilde's play An Ideal Husband, where Lady Chiltern struggles to love her husband after discovering his wealth came from corruption. The plot hinges on him performing a morally courageous act to win back her affection. Wilde understood something profound. Moral character is sexually attractive in a way that goes beyond rational calculation. This suggests that many of our most prized moral virtues evolved not because they helped us survive, but because they helped us reproduce. Sympathy, generosity, fairness, sexual fidelity, good parenting. These traits make us more attractive to potential mates. They're sexual ornaments like a peacock's tail, but for the moral dimension of human nature. This perspective explains some puzzling aspects of human morality. Why do we engage in costly moral displays that seem to serve no practical purpose? Why do we sometimes choose moral action even when it hurts our immediate interests? Because morality functions as a handicap, a costly signal that demonstrates our character. Just as a peacock's elaborate tail signals genetic fitness by showing the bird can survive despite carrying such an expensive ornament, moral behavior signals character by showing we can afford to act ethically even when it costs us. The essence of moral displays isn't necessarily the benefit they provide to others, but the personal cost they represent. This doesn't make morality less real or less important. Sexual selection has given us music, art, language, and countless other features that make life worth living. If morality is partly a product of sexual selection, it joins some pretty impressive company. But here's what's crucial to understand. This evolutionary perspective doesn't mean we're secretly selfish beneath our moral veneer. Evolution builds motivations, not conscious strategies. We genuinely care about others, feel real guilt when we do wrong, and experience authentic satisfaction when we act ethically. The fact that these feelings evolved because they helped our ancestors attract mates doesn't make them any less real. What it does mean is that morality is more complicated than simple altruism. We're not moral because we're angels trying to overcome our animal nature. We're moral because morality is part of our animal nature, a sophisticated biological system that evolved to solve the complex social problems faced by a highly intelligent, highly social species. This evolutionary lens also helps explain why moral behavior isn't uniform. If morality were just about survival or group benefit, we'd expect it to be more consistent. But if it's partly about attracting mates and signaling character, then we'd expect it to be contextual, strategic, and sometimes even competitive. And that's exactly what we see. People are more generous when others are watching. We're more likely to act ethically when it enhances our reputation. We sometimes engage in competitive altruism, trying to out-generous each other in social settings. None of this makes us bad people. It makes us human, creatures whose moral sense evolved through the same processes that gave us everything else about our psychology. Understanding the evolutionary roots of morality doesn't diminish its importance. It helps us understand why it works the way it does, and perhaps how we might make it work better. Let's talk about a group of humans whose moral behavior often baffles and frustrates adults, children, and adolescents. If you've ever watched a teenager make a spectacularly poor ethical decision and wondered what on earth they were thinking, neuroscience has some answers, and they're both reassuring and terrifying. Here's a story that perfectly captures the complexity of moral development. A woman goes holiday shopping. Her husband warns her about theft. She parks close to the mall entrance, does her shopping, returns to her car, and drives home. Only then does she notice an unfamiliar college sticker on the rear window and realize, in a moment of pure horror, that she's accidentally stolen someone else's car. Her key had started a stranger's vehicle, a near impossible fluke. What happens next is fascinating from a moral development perspective. Instead of seeing the humor in the situation or calmly rectifying it, she panics. She drives back to the mall in terror, parks the car as close as possible to where she found it, sneaks back to her own vehicle, and flees. She never leaves a note, never contacts authorities, never tries to explain the innocent mistake to the car's owner. This woman spent the night, consumed with guilt, too embarrassed to tell her husband, and carried the secret for years. Her behavior mirrors exactly what we see in children caught making mistakes. The instinct to flee, to avoid responsibility, to hope the problem just disappears. The reason for this seemingly irrational behavior lies in the brain's development timeline, specifically the frontal lobe, the part of our brain responsible for planning, impulse control, and moral reasoning. This critical region develops slowly over the first 2 decades of life, which explains why children and adolescents frequently demonstrate poor moral judgment. When faced with a moral dilemma, the adult brain must perform incredibly complex calculations. How will this action harm or benefit others? What are the long-term consequences? How would I feel if our roles were reversed? What would happen if everyone behaved this way? These questions require sophisticated cognitive abilities that simply aren't fully online in developing brains. But it gets more complicated than just brain development. Moral beliefs operate on intricate principles of logic, reason, societal norms, and personal benefit, but these principles can only be broadly applied. Each moral situation has unique aspects that must be evaluated separately, requiring significant cognitive resources that young people are still developing. Consider the moral complexity in this scenario. Finding money on the sidewalk. Most people wouldn't turn a quarter into the police, but what about $1,000? As the stakes increase, our moral calculations become more complex. What if you found that money in a wallet belonging to a wealthy person, and you needed it for life-saving medicine for your child? Pose these progressively complex scenarios to college students, and you'll get a spectrum of answers that reveals just how context-dependent moral judgment really is. This contextual nature of morality explains why adolescents face such volatile moral decision-making. Their brains are undergoing massive changes, with neural connections forming and reforming under the influence of powerful hormones and environmental pressures. The result is moral reasoning that can seem inconsistent, impulsive, and sometimes downright incomprehensible to adults. But here's what's crucial to understand. This isn't a design flaw. The extended period of moral development serves important functions. It allows young people to learn the complex social rules of their particular culture, to experiment with different moral frameworks, and to develop the sophisticated reasoning abilities they'll need as adults. The problem arises when we expect consistent moral behavior from brains that are still under construction. A teenager might demonstrate sophisticated moral reasoning in one situation and then make a seemingly thoughtless decision in another. This isn't hypocrisy, it's development. What's particularly interesting is how emotional intensity affects moral judgment in developing brains. Adults often react childishly when confronted with their own mistakes, just like the woman with the wrong car. When faced with discomfort or embarrassment, the impulse to flee or fabricate explanations to avoid blame can override more mature moral responses. This reveals something important. Moral development isn't just about acquiring knowledge or principles. It's about developing the emotional regulation and cognitive flexibility to apply those principles consistently, especially under stress. The volatility of adolescent moral decision-making also reflects the fact that moral beliefs may begin taking shape during these years. But the ability to consistently act upon them with sound judgment is a skill that often takes years to mature. It's like having a sophisticated moral software installed on hardware that's still being upgraded. Understanding this developmental perspective doesn't excuse poor moral choices, but it does provide context for why moral education and patient guidance are so crucial during these formative years. We're not just teaching young people what's right and wrong. We're helping them develop the cognitive and emotional tools they'll need to make good moral decisions throughout their lives. The takeaway isn't that young people are morally inferior, but that moral competence, like any complex skill, develops over time. And perhaps more importantly, it reminds us that even as adults, our moral reasoning can be compromised by stress, emotion, and situational factors in ways that mirror the challenges faced by developing brains. Let's take a journey back in time, way back, to understand something that might surprise you about the relationship between religion and morality. If you're like most people, you probably assume that religion and ethics have always been intertwined, that spiritual beliefs have always served as the foundation for moral behavior. But the archaeological record tells a very different story. When European scholars in the 19th century began studying what they called primitive religions, they made a startling discovery. These belief systems were almost completely devoid of moral content. Edward Tyler, writing in 1874, observed that the religions of savage societies were almost devoid of that ethical element, which to the educated modern mind is the very mainstream of practical religion. Now, before you conclude that these societies were moral wastelands, understand that Tyler was careful to note that their moral standards were actually well-defined and praiseworthy. The crucial difference was that these ethical laws stood on their own ground of tradition and public opinion, rather than being rooted in religious foundation. Think about what this means. For the vast majority of human history, we're talking about the lifestyle that shaped our species for hundreds of thousands of years. People had elaborate spiritual beliefs, but kept them completely separate from their moral systems. Gods and spirits were involved in all sorts of things, but human ethical behavior wasn't one of them. Consider the K'ung people and their relationship with the great god Gaona. As ethnographer Lorna Marshall discovered, man's wrongdoing against man is not left to Gaona's punishment, nor is it considered to be his concern. Man corrects or avenges such wrongdoings himself in his social context. The divine and the moral occupied completely separate spheres. This isn't to say that hunter-gatherer societies never used supernatural beliefs to influence behavior. Some Australian Aborigines believed spirits were irritated by excessive chatter or frivolity. When Charles Darwin visited Tierra del Fuego, he encountered locals who spoke of a giant being that punished serious crimes like murder by bringing bad weather. But these were exceptions, not the rule. The broader pattern was captured perfectly by an anthropologist studying the Klamath. Relations to the spirits have no ethical implication. This was the norm, not the exception. Here's what's really mind-bending. Most hunter-gatherer societies don't employ the ultimate moral incentives that seem so central to modern religions. No heaven for the virtuous, no hell for the wicked, no karma determining your next life based on moral conduct. There's typically an afterlife, but it's almost never used as moral leverage. When there is differentiation in the afterlife, it's usually based on how you died, not how you lived. Many Andaman Islanders believed drowning victims became sea spirits, while others became jungle spirits. The Haida thought those who drowned turned into killer whales. Your eternal fate depended on circumstances, not character. So why this separation between the spiritual and the moral? The answer lies in the social structure of hunter-gatherer societies. These groups live in small, intimate, essentially transparent communities. Think 30 to 50 people who know everything about each other's business. In such a setting, significant misconduct is nearly impossible to conceal. If you steal someone's digging stick, where would you hide it? And what's the point if you can't use it without everyone knowing? The risk of incurring not just the victim's wrath, but sustained community suspicion serves as a powerful deterrent. More importantly, these societies operate on principles that evolutionary psychologists argue are fundamental to human nature: kin selection and reciprocal altruism. In a typical hunter-gatherer village, most people are either relatives you're inclined to help or non-kin friends with whom you have ongoing cooperative relationships. The majority of people around you fall into your natural sphere of ethical consideration. This creates what anthropologist Elman Service called a situation where values like love, generosity, and honesty are not preached nor buttressed by threat of religious reprisal, because they do not need to be. The social structure itself enforces morality more effectively than any supernatural threat could. But here's the crucial limitation. This moral consideration doesn't extend to strangers. In fact, outsiders are often viewed simply as enemies rather than people deserving moral consideration. There are no anonymous relationships in these societies, no opportunities for the kind of large-scale moral challenges that characterize modern life. This narrow scope of moral concern might seem harsh compared to modern ideals of universal love and global human rights, but it represents the moral environment for which our species evolved. Small groups of interconnected people where reputation mattered more than any divine commandment. Understanding this background helps explain why the expansion of moral concern beyond the immediate tribe has been such a monumental challenge for human societies. When religions eventually did begin incorporating moral teachings, they were essentially trying to expand our natural moral instincts beyond their evolutionary design parameters. The implications are profound. If religion and morality evolved separately, then moral behavior doesn't require religious belief, and religious belief doesn't automatically generate moral behavior. The relationship between the two is more complex, more historically contingent, and more culturally variable than either ardent believers or militant atheists often acknowledge. This ancient separation also suggests that our current struggles with moral behavior in large, anonymous societies aren't a sign of moral decay, but rather evidence that we're still learning how to be ethical in social environments radically different from those that shaped our species. Finding such insights into human morality and our evolving social instincts fascinating. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow the podcast on your favorite platforms: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and more. Subscribing ensures you never miss an episode and helps us keep bringing you thought-provoking discussions on the science of human behavior. Now let's venture into some of the most contentious territory in modern society: the moral differences between political conservatives and liberals. If you have ever wondered why these two groups seem to be speaking completely different languages when they discuss ethics, psychology has some fascinating answers. Here's the setup. Imagine two equally intelligent, equally educated people watching the same news story about someone criticizing their own country to foreign journalists. One person is outraged by the disloyalty. The other is proud of the free speech. Same facts, completely different moral reactions. This isn't about intelligence or information. It's about operating with fundamentally different moral operating systems. Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist who's revolutionized our understanding of political psychology, has identified 6 core foundations of human morality: care versus harm, fairness versus cheating, liberty versus oppression, loyalty versus betrayal, authority versus subversion, and sanctity versus degradation. Here's where it gets interesting. Liberals and conservatives don't just disagree about politics. They literally weight these moral foundations differently. It's like they're playing the same game, but with completely different rule books. Liberals tend to prioritize the first 3 foundations: care, fairness, and liberty. They're the moral warriors against suffering, inequality, and oppression. Ask a liberal what's wrong with society, and they'll typically point to people being hurt, treated unfairly, or having their freedom restricted. Conservatives, meanwhile, place heavy emphasis on all 6 foundations, but they particularly value the last 3: loyalty, authority, and sanctity. They're concerned not just with individual harm, but with social cohesion, respect for legitimate authority, and maintaining sacred values and institutions. This creates predictable conflicts. Is it acceptable to criticize your group to outsiders? Liberals often say yes, if the criticism is justified. Fairness and truth matter more than group loyalty. Conservatives say no. Loyalty to your community should prevent you from airing dirty laundry in public. Should people disobey unjust laws? Liberals advocate civil disobedience when laws violate fairness or individual rights. Conservatives worry that undermining legal authority, even for good reasons, threatens social stability. Is burning the flag protected speech or moral desecration? Liberals see a piece of cloth and focus on free expression. Conservatives see a sacred symbol and feel genuine disgust at its destruction. These aren't just political disagreements. They're rooted in deep psychological differences. Research consistently shows that conservatives, on average, have higher anxiety about ambiguity, seek closure more intensely, dislike novelty, and find comfort in structure and hierarchy. They're more likely to perceive situations as threatening and have a narrower range of empathy. This might sound like criticism, but it's not. These psychological differences reflect legitimate trade-offs. Conservative preferences for predictability and structure can provide social stability and continuity. Liberal openness to change and focus on individual rights can drive progress and justice. Both orientations solve real social problems. The conservative tendency to view the world as more threatening helps explain their emphasis on binding foundations, like loyalty, authority, and sanctity. If you see the world as dangerous, then group cohesion, respect for protective authority, and maintenance of stabilizing traditions become crucial for survival. Interestingly, this threat perception difference extends beyond politics. Experiments show that authoritarian conservatives respond faster to threatening words like cancer or snake compared to neutral words like telescope or tree. They're more likely to interpret ambiguous stimuli as menacing and report having more nightmares, especially about loss of personal power. Terror management theory suggests that much of conservatism stems from a profound fear of death, and research supports this. Priming people to think about mortality temporarily increases conservative attitudes. But here's a paradox that confounds simple political stereotypes. Despite their heightened threat perception and anxiety, conservatives consistently report being happier than liberals. How is this possible? Part of the answer lies in the psychological comfort that conservative ideologies provide. Clear hierarchies, traditional roles, and stable institutions offer certainty in an uncertain world. Additionally, system justification, the tendency to defend and rationalize existing social arrangements, allows conservatives to accept inequalities more easily, reducing cognitive dissonance. As economic inequality increases, the happiness gap between conservatives and liberals actually widens, suggesting that conservatives' ability to justify systemic disparities protects them from the psychological distress that such inequalities cause in liberals. This analysis helps explain some puzzling political phenomena, like why economically disadvantaged white Americans often vote for politicians whose policies seem to work against their financial interests. This isn't because they think they'll become wealthy and benefit from tax cuts for the rich. Instead, it reflects a psychological inclination toward system justification and risk aversion. Better to stick with familiar systems, even flawed ones, than risk unknown alternatives. Even within specific groups, these psychological differences persist. Conservative gay Americans show more implicit bias against their own identity than liberal gay Americans, again reflecting the conservative tendency toward system justification even when the system disadvantages them personally. Understanding these psychological foundations doesn't resolve political disagreements, but it does explain why those disagreements are so persistent and emotionally charged. Conservatives and liberals aren't just advocating different policies. They're defending different visions of what morality itself means. The implications are profound. If political ideology reflects deep psychological differences in moral intuition, then simply providing more information or better arguments is unlikely to change minds. Instead, effective political communication might require speaking to moral values that resonate with different psychological orientations. This doesn't mean moral relativism or that all political positions are equally valid, but it does suggest that moral and political disagreements are more complex than simple conflicts between good and evil, smart and stupid, or informed and ignorant. They're conflicts between different but coherent ways of organizing moral priorities. Let's end our journey with perhaps the most practical discovery in moral psychology: the surprising power of moral reminders to instantly improve ethical behavior. This isn't about long-term character development or philosophical education. This is about simple interventions that can dramatically reduce dishonesty and cheating in real time. Here's an experiment that will change how you think about human nature. Researchers asked college students to complete math problems and gave them opportunities to cheat for money. Some students cheated a little, as expected. But then, researchers tried something simple. They asked another group of students to recall the 10 Commandments before doing the same task. These students, including self-identified atheists, cheated 0%. Not a little less. 0. Think about that for a moment. A brief reminder of moral standards, even ones the participants didn't necessarily believe in, completely eliminated dishonest behavior. This suggests something profound about human psychology. We're not fundamentally dishonest creatures constrained by moral rules. We're fundamentally moral creatures who sometimes lose sight of our values. The researchers wondered if this was just about religion, so they tried a secular version. They had students at MIT and Yale sign an honor code statement before the cheating opportunity. The twist? Neither MIT nor Yale actually has an honor code, but students who signed the non-existent honor code showed the same result: 0 cheating. This led to an obvious question. Do honor codes actually work long-term? Princeton University has maintained a rigorous honor system since 1893. Freshmen sign the Honor Code Constitution, attend required talks about academic integrity, and even hear an Honor Code song performed by the campus music ensemble. Throughout their time at Princeton, They sign honor pledges on every paper and exam and receive regular reminders from the honor committee. Surely this extensive moral education would create lasting changes in behavior? The researchers tested Princeton students 2 weeks after their ethics training. When reminded to sign the honor code, they didn't cheat, just like students everywhere. But without that immediate reminder, they cheated just as much as students from schools without honor codes. This reveals both discouraging and hopeful insights. The discouraging news: changing behavior to be more ethical long-term is incredibly difficult. Short-term ethics training, even intensive programs, may not create lasting changes. This has implications for corporate ethics training, business school curricula, and any institution trying to create cultural shifts toward more ethical behavior. The hopeful news: people seem naturally inclined toward honesty when reminded of moral standards. The honor code method works regardless of whether there are serious penalties for dishonesty. This suggests that incorporating moral reminders into situations where temptation is likely could be a remarkably effective strategy. But the story gets even more interesting when we consider the emotion of disgust, perhaps the strangest member of our moral toolkit. Disgust originally evolved to keep dangerous things out of our mouths. But humans have transformed this basic protective mechanism into a sophisticated moral enforcement system. Consider how disgust functions in cultural contexts. Many societies emphasize a sharp separation between humans and animals, viewing humans as more divine or sacred. This creates a problem. Human bodies function very much like animal bodies. We eat, defecate, reproduce, bleed, and die, just like other animals. For cultures determined to deny human animality, disgust becomes the vigilant enforcer of standards that maintain the illusion of human transcendence. Imagine people living without clothes, neglecting hygiene, engaging in public sexual behavior, and eating raw meat directly from carcasses. The visceral disgust this scenario provokes isn't just aesthetic, it's moral. Disgust acts as the guardian of human dignity, the protector of what many cultures consider the sacred nature of human existence. Cotton Mather, the 17th century Puritan, captured this perfectly when he witnessed a dog urinating at the same time he did. Disgusted by the parallel, he wrote in his diary, "Yet I will be a more noble creature, and at the very time when my natural necessities debase me into the condition of the beast, my spirit shall rise and soar." This connection between disgust and morality helps explain why moral violations often produce visceral, gut-level reactions rather than purely intellectual disapproval. Different cultures emphasize different aspects of this disgust-morality connection, but the underlying mechanism appears universal. Research in Brazil and the United States revealed that well-educated Americans of higher social status relied heavily on individual rights and fairness in their moral reasoning, the ethic of autonomy. But Brazilians and people from lower social classes in both countries showed stronger preferences for community loyalty and sacred values, where disgust plays a larger role in moral judgment. This suggests that our moral minds are incredibly sophisticated, context-sensitive systems that can be influenced by everything from immediate reminders to deep cultural programming to basic emotions like disgust. The practical implications are significant. If dishonesty is driven more by rationalization than by cost-benefit calculation, then preventing moral failures requires changing how people think about their actions, not just changing the incentives. Moral reminders work by disrupting our ability to rationalize selfish behavior, making it harder to maintain our self-image as good people while acting badly. Understanding the role of disgust in morality also helps explain why some moral violations feel so fundamentally wrong, beyond any rational calculation of harm. When someone violates sacred values or degrades human dignity, the disgust response creates a sense of moral certainty that transcends philosophical argument. Together, these insights suggest that moral behavior is far more malleable than we typically assume, but also far more complex than simple rule following. We are creatures with sophisticated moral intuitions that can be activated by simple reminders, shaped by cultural learning, and triggered by emotions that evolved for entirely different purposes. The challenge is learning to work with this complex system rather than against it, designing institutions and social norms that activate our better angels, rather than hoping that good intentions and moral education will be enough. As we reach the end of our journey through the moral maze, what have we discovered? Perhaps most importantly, that human morality is both more complex and more malleable than we typically imagine. We've seen that our moral judgments can shift based on factors as seemingly irrelevant as whether we're hungry, what language we're thinking in, or how clean our environment is. We've discovered that cultures operate with fundamentally different moral operating systems, autonomy, community, and divinity, that can make communication across moral differences extraordinarily challenging. We've examined the psychological differences that make conservatives and liberals seem to inhabit different moral universes, each emphasizing different aspects of our evolved moral toolkit. And we've discovered the surprising power of simple moral reminders to instantly improve ethical behavior, along with the complex role that disgust plays in enforcing cultural standards of human dignity. What emerges from this exploration is a picture of morality as a sophisticated, multi-layered system that's both universal and culturally variable, both rational and emotional, both stable and surprisingly flexible. We're not simply good or evil creatures. We're moral creatures, operating with ancient instincts in modern environments, trying to solve ethical problems our ancestors never faced. The implications are both humbling and empowering. Humbling because our moral certainties are more fragile and context-dependent than we'd like to admit. Empowering because understanding how our moral minds work gives us tools for improving ethical behavior, both individually and collectively. Perhaps most importantly, this journey through moral psychology suggests that the great moral challenges of our time, from political polarization to global cooperation to ethical innovation, aren't just about finding the right principles or making better arguments. They're about understanding how moral minds work and designing institutions, cultures, and practices that bring out the best in our complex moral nature. The moral maze isn't a problem to be solved, but a landscape to be navigated with wisdom, humility, and science. And that navigation begins with understanding that every human mind contains multitudes, competing moral systems, ancient instincts, and remarkable capacities for both selfishness and stunning generosity. In the end, morality isn't about perfection, it's about recognition. Recognition that we're all walking through the same maze, just from different starting points and with different internal compasses. And perhaps that recognition itself is the beginning of moral wisdom. Outro music begins. I'm your host, Beatrice Goodwin, and thank you for joining me with yet another episode of The Social Lens. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the moral maze. I hope it's given you new ways to think about the ethical choices we all face, and perhaps a bit more compassion for the complexity of moral life. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow the podcast on your favorite platforms: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and more. Your support helps us bring you even more thought-provoking content every week. And if you're hungry for deeper dives into psychology, ethics, and the hidden forces shaping our world, check out Scoob, the AI-powered podcast app that curates the best shows to match your curiosity. Download the Scoob app from the App Store or Play Store and keep your journey of discovery going anytime, anywhere. Until next time, keep questioning, keep growing, and keep walking the path of ethical understanding.